Good afternoon. I'm Linda Lara from the Aspen Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to the Alma and Joseph Gildenhorn Book Series. Today's conversation is with Pulitzer Prize winning author Marin Sherwin, a professor of history at George Mason University. His book is Gambling with Armageddon, Nuclear Roulette from Hiroshima to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Some of us are old enough to remember the dramatic, nail-biting standoff between the United States and Russia over delivery of missiles to Cuba, which is recounted in Marty's book, along with looks at the consequences of the evolving place of nuclear weapons in a post-World War II world. The moderator for today's discussion is Ken Adelman, former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations and Director of the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency under President Reagan. Ken is also a well-known seminar leader at the Aspen Institute. His book, Reagan at Reykjavik, is now being turned into a feature film. Before turning the program over to him, I want to remind you that you can submit questions by clicking the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Also, thanks to our friends at Politics and Prose Bookstore, you'll be able to purchase Marty Sherwin's book at a 10% discount. Over the next couple of days, we'll be sending you an email with a link for the offer. And now I'd like to turn the program over to Ken Adelman.
Thank you, Linda. Marty, let's just get started right away because we have so much to cover right here. When you look at the literature, you see that there's an awesome literature on the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's Graham Allison's book, The Essence of a Decision. There's Bobby Kennedy's book, 13 Days. There's Mike Mobb's. There's shelves and shelves of the Cuban Missile Crisis books. What made you think 10 years ago that you could really contribute here?
Thank you, Ken. I want to thank the Aspen Institute for allowing me to join this distinguished Alma and Joe Gildenhorn series. I want to thank them. Response to your question. I taught the Cuban Missile Crisis for, close to 50 years. I was a participant in the crisis back when I was a young Lieutenant JG in the Navy Air Force. And as I taught the crisis, I became convinced more and more that it was the seminal event of the Cold War. And so from a personal level, having been involved with it, and from a scholarly level, I decided that this was a subject that I needed to attack.
Mm-hmm. And you thought you had something new to contribute? Why?
I thought that there were issues that needed reinterpretation, mm-hmm. and there were also there was also a lack of context, I thought. So instead of starting with the Cuban Revolution or just focusing on the 13 days as Robert Kennedy did, I decided that it was important to really understand the deep roots of the crisis. And the more I probed backwards, the more I was drawn to Hiroshima. The Cuban Missile Crisis did not come out of the sky suddenly because Khrushchev got this crazy idea to sneak missiles into Cuba. It was something that evolved over 17 years of nuclear weapons becoming more and more central to the Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union.
And Marty, let me just tell you, I told you before, it's a marvelous book. It's just a real force. And as Linda said, it's a nail biter, but it's a page turner. It's just everything. And I think one of the real contributions you made is putting it into a larger context where you see Bobby Kennedy's 13 days, or Graham Allison's book, they start with the Cuban Missile Crisis and they last, 15 days or something like that. And you're just very good at putting it into the larger context. When you say, it's the most important part of the Cold War, and we came very close to extinction. How close did we come, Marty?
Well, somewhere between 40 seconds and 2 minutes, depending on how you read the evidence. And what I mean by that is the story that I begin the book with, the Soviet submarines patrolling in the quarantine area. One of the submarines, B-59, was being followed very closely by anti-submarine forces. And the American ASW forces were dropping explosives on the sub to try to force it to the surface, not to try to
that's
sink
the
it.
That's the anti guys, right? They were dropping.
The
ASW. Yeah.
ASW. And the captain of the Soviet submarine, Savitsky, panicked. He was sure that the Americans were trying to sink him. He had on board, as the other submarines also had, a nuclear torpedo with about a 15 kiloton warhead, about the same size warhead that destroyed Hiroshima. And he told the special weapons officer to load that torpedo, and he screams, "We will sink them all. We cannot be the shame of the Soviet fleet." And he's ready to destroy the American aircraft carrier. But at the very last minute, another Soviet officer on board recognizes, for a variety of reasons, that the explosives are not meant to sink the sub, but just as warnings to the sub to bring it to the surface. And he intervenes and prevents essentially World War III from breaking out.
How do you know all this, Marty?
Articles that have been written by the Soviets, a lot of work by Svetlana Savranskaya, who is at the George Washington National Security Archive, and interviews. It's not a question of interpretation. It's really a matter of fact.
Right. And what it shows, I think, is that while we concentrate on Khrushchev and Kennedy, and we're going to get into their views, there's a lot going on that they have no idea about, that they have no control over, that they, just hope things work out while they're, communicating with each other. But it's the stuff beneath them and below them that could blow this all up.
Exactly. Neither Khrushchev nor Kennedy wanted a war, but as George Bundy once said to me, crisis managers cannot control everything, cannot manage everything. And a complicated international event is controlled at the top by the leaders of the countries involved. But there are a lot of people doing the work, so to speak, on the ground that can make decisions that can end up undermining what the leaders hope will happen. A good example is the shoot-down, the Iranian shoot-down of the airplane back several years ago.
Yep. All right, let's talk about the leaders for a minute. Why did Khrushchev want to sneak nuclear missiles into Cuba?
Well, the Bay of Pigs is central to the whole story. When the Bay of Pigs invasion failed, both Castro...
And that was roughly 1 year...
1 year early, April of 1961.
1961, yeah. And a new Kennedy was in office. He was brand new. and he was taking up the legacy of the Eisenhower administration, basically.
Exactly. He had been in office for 4 months when the Bay of Pigs occurred. There's an interesting thing about the Bay of Pigs that I need to put on the table.
That's another. We can ask Linda for another seminar on that.
Right. No. This is important because it relates to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So before the Bay of Pigs invasion, Kennedy made it very clear to the CIA that American troops would not be sent in to support the invaders if they failed. The CIA didn't believe him. They didn't think any American president would allow a failure. Well, Kennedy refused to send the troops in. Now, a lot of people say, well, you know, that was a failure of nerve. It wasn't a failure of nerve. What it was a determination to be absolutely clear to these people that when I say something, I mean it. And that same determination is shown during the Cuban Missile Crisis in terms of Kennedy's absolute commitment to doing whatever he could to avoid sliding into a nuclear war that he did not want and Khrushchev did not want.
Okay, Marty, we're going to talk. Let me get back to Khrushchev. Why did he sneak the missiles into Cuba?
Okay. Because he was sure that the United States was going to follow up with an invasion of Cuba. And he thought, well, you know, if I put a lot of troops there, the United States can overwhelm those troops. If I just put tactical nuclear weapons there, the United States, and announce it, the United States can invade using tactical nuclear weapons. But if I put the same kind of missiles that Eisenhower ordered sent to Turkey and Italy, intermediate range, medium range nuclear missiles, the United States will not dare to invade Cuba. Number one. Number two, the United States had a huge lead over the Soviet Union in intercontinental missiles. And by putting his missiles in Cuba, Khrushchev would close the gap a bit.
Gotcha. And so it was to rectify the nuclear balance in a kind of sneaky way there. Yep, I understand. And how do you think Kennedy did overall?
Well, it's an amazing story. And one of the most...
That's why your book is an amazing book, Marty.
Well, thank you. You know...
As Liz said before, you won the Pulitzer Prize, so I was thinking, hey, you know, maybe you should get an Oscar for this book, or maybe you should get an Emmy, or you know, a Super Bowl ring, or something like that. Because I don't know what's higher than a Pulitzer Prize, but this, I mean, your other book on Oppenheimer with Kai Bird was absolutely magnificent, and those years ago, I think we gave a book party for it. Said it was an absolutely wonderful book, so put me down as a real groupie of your writing. And, but you know, you just did a terrific job here. But go on, tell us in short form how Kennedy worked. Okay,
well, you know, we have the most amazing evidence of a president's thinking during a crisis. Kennedy had a secret tape recording system put in the Oval Office in the cabinet room. And we have the exact words that McNamara said, that Kennedy said, that Bobby said, you know, and so on and so forth. And what is so interesting is to watch the president's mind begin to wrap around this problem. On October 16th, the first day when he is informed that the missiles are in Cuba, he is, along with everybody else, convinced that the only way to get those missiles out is to bomb them. Several days later, he has changed his mind. How has he changed his mind? Adlai Stevenson, his UN ambassador, is a significant influence, which has not been reported by other historians, and that's one of my one of the points that I think is very important in my book. By the end of the crisis, the president is isolated. He's alone. He is the only member of this group of advisors who is willing to trade the missiles that Eisenhower had ordered put in Turkey in exchange for Khrushchev getting the missiles out of Cuba. And how that process evolves, I follow that intimately, and I think it's incredible. I mean, you and I, we all make decisions over time, but we forget the details of the process of how we changed our minds. But we have this amazing event on record, and that becomes the structure for my understanding of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Well, it's absolutely terrific because it's riveting to see how these guys behave day after day after day. And to tell you the truth, it's not terribly impressive. As you say at one point in the book, it seemed to start every day anew. It seemed like there was nothing built on yesterday's discussion. Seemed like no one remembered yesterday's discussion. Here they were for the first time talking about it. And you had people, like Robert McNamara, who was never a great favorite of mine, saying, oh, no, this doesn't matter. They have missiles in Cuba for various reasons he gave, but let's go invade regardless. And, you think to yourself, hold on, is there an adult in the room here?
Yeah, the adult was the president. And Adlai Stevenson, and I would say George Ball also plays a pretty good role, and Llewellyn Thompson, the ambassador to former ambassador to Russia, to the Soviet Union. So there's a whole range of attitudes, but in the end, it is only President Kennedy who is determined to do whatever it takes to avoid a nuclear war, assuming that Khrushchev does not want a nuclear war, and he doesn't. And one of the things that's so interesting about the book is the lack of understanding on each side of what the other side is thinking, and the intelligence. I mean, American CIA intelligence about what was going on in Cuba was way off the mark. For example, the CIA had estimated that there were 11,000 Soviet troops in Cuba. 40,000, right? That's right, 42,000.
And nukes. There were nukes all over Cuba.
There were tactical nuclear weapons there, which we didn't know about. So if Kennedy had followed the advice of many of his ex-com advisors and all of the Joint Chiefs and had agreed to an invasion of Cuba, the invaders, 90,000 American troops, would have been met by 42,000 Soviet troops when they thought there were 11,000, plus all the Cuban troops, and tactical nuclear weapons. Now, can you imagine, what would have happened? World War III would have happened, for sure.
Let's get back to, the decision-making process. And I thought at the beginning, when you were going to say what's new about your book, is you just have these tapes. And it's quite amazing that people are flipping from day to day. And all of a sudden, Kennedy sees that Adlai Stevenson's advice that happened, by chance, because he wasn't even a member of the meeting. Tell us about that. He was at some lunch with a Libyan prince or something like that. And Kennedy grabbed that. It was the damnedest thing I ever heard.
Yeah. Well, one of the themes of the book is luck. Certainly and that's why I begin with the Soviet submarine story. Yeah. But there was luck throughout the book. The book is filled with surprises. I was surprised when I did this research. It was a very lucky thing that just by chance, Adlai Stevenson came down from New York on that particular day, October 16th. He had meetings at the State Department in the morning. He had arranged a luncheon with the president. after his State Department meetings. And after lunch, the president took him up to the family quarters and said, look at these photographs. And he showed her, and he said to Stevenson, we're going to have to bomb and possibly invade Cuba to get rid of these missiles. And Stevenson, who has a very different orientation to dealing with Cold War problems than Kennedy has, says, whoa, we should not invade, we should not bomb until we have tried to solve this diplomatically. I think we can, and so on and so forth. And how do we know that? Because the next day, Stevenson writes a memorandum to Kennedy summarizing their conversation. And it's really interesting to see that, in effect, Stevenson lays out the entire blueprint that Kennedy followed, except for one thing. Stevenson was willing to suggest giving Guantanamo back to the Cubans, which a lot of us wish he had done, given, you know, but in any case, okay.
Still 50 years ago,
okay. So in any case, that blueprint is what Kennedy follows, even with regard to the details of his speech on October 22nd. But when the crisis is all over, Kennedy, who dislikes Stevenson, really stabs him in the back. He encourages an article by Bartlett and Alsop in the Saturday Evening Post that makes the charge that Stevenson wanted a Munich. And what's so interesting about it, which is a comment that Kennedy penciled in to the draft that he got to read. But what's so interesting about it is that, in fact, it was Kennedy who preferred a Munich to a nuclear war. Thank God. So, you know, Kennedy's very complicated.
Very complicated is a nice way of putting it. I'll take that, Marty. At the Aspen Institute, which you know very well because Susan, your wife, was of the Aspen Institute for all these years and did just a wonderful job over the years. And under Dan Porterfield, you know, really looking at value-based leadership. Okay, so let's talk about value-based leadership in the Aspen Institute for 1 minute. You have Kennedy in his official capacity at the ExCom, as you say, orchestrating the debate, moving it towards Adelman. Okay, and Stevenson few, and thank God he did, because it was the right view and just a one contribution, and that was really wonderful value-based leadership. On the other hand, you have Kennedy savaging Stevenson unnecessarily. It doesn't help him one bit. His sex life seems to continue, at least at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, in a way that's absolutely disgusting that you put it in there. We generally think, Marty, that people are one character, you know, and you can see that in their view, your private view. It doesn't seem to be the case here. You seem to be, the public Kennedy is magnificent in terms of his values. In privacy and in personal terms, he seems to be absolutely disgusting.
I talk about three presidents, Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy. They were all very, very different personalities. I would say that for Truman, what you saw is what you got. Mm-hmm. For Eisenhower and Kennedy, in very, very different ways, they were very different in the decision-making processes of government and in their public personas. And that's just the way it is. It probably is true of, you know, most politicians. I have no interest in trying to cover over all of Kennedy's really terrible things he did, both in terms of his personal behavior and also his political behavior. He was I would call it a raw politician. He would do whatever it took to win. And once he was finished with the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was going to put Adlai Stevenson down, whose reputation had been raised during the crisis because of his performance at the United Nations. So that's part of what makes the story so interesting, I guess.
Marty, you haven't mentioned Fidel Castro at all. What's his role in this scene?
Well, Castro's very interesting, and
I'm very interesting.
I'm very glad you brought that up, because he plays actually a major role in the crisis, which is totally ignored by the Americans who are trying to decide how to deal with this process. First of all, he agrees to Khrushchev's request to put the missiles in Cuba. That's number one. Number two, at the end of the crisis, there are some small things in between, but at the end of the crisis, Castro writes a letter to Khrushchev on Saturday night, October 27th, saying if the United States invades Cuba, the Soviet Union should launch its missiles, intercontinental missiles, and the missiles in Cuba against the United States. Khrushchev receives this, and he said, "What is going on here? This guy misunderstands everything I was trying to do. I didn't want to start a war." But that afternoon, an American U-2 had been shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile, which Khrushchev had not authorized. So Khrushchev feels everything is falling apart in Cuba, and Castro wants to start a war. And so Castro actually controls, in a large part, the timing of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the ending of it. He also controls the post-Cuban Missile Crisis, because Kennedy has agreed not to invade Cuba and to secretly to take the Jupiter missiles out of Turkey, but on the condition that UN inspectors are allowed into Cuba to make sure the missiles go back to Moscow. Castro says, "No way. Cuba is an independent country. I have 5 conditions before anybody is allowed in. One of them is give back Guantanamo. The other is stop harassing Cuba, and so on and so forth." So Castro plays a very important role.
Yeah, as I told you before, we're going to go to questions from participants. But as I told you before, Marty, in the mid 1990s, I was in Cuba for something, and he pulled me out of a line and berated me for being part of the Reagan administration killing communism. I said, if that's on my tombstone, I'll be happy. And he started talking to me about wheat production or some damn thing. And I went back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in essence, he was very mad at Khrushchev at the beginning of the crisis for sneaking the missiles in when there was such an imbalance. And at the end of the crisis, he thought he was just hightailing it out. So, he was kind of furious about the whole thing, and that's reflected in your book very nicely. Let's go back to some of the questions. One is, how did Bobby Kennedy actually do in the crisis?
Well, that's one of the
book and bragging.
Sure, that's one of the major surprises when Bobby Kennedy wrote his memoir of the Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 Days. Someone said who read the draft, said, I thought your brother was a president during the crisis. You know, and Bobby paints himself as a dove from the beginning. We have the tapes. We have the evidence. He's a dove when John Kennedy tells Bobby what to do, and he is as hawkish as almost anybody else during other times. So the picture of Bobby Kennedy is very different than Bobby Kennedy's memoir paints himself.
Yeah, and when you read, day by day of your XCOM, the minutes, everybody seems to be jumping all over the place. It's very hard to see consistency in anybody's argument. I mean, I guess Ball, and Stevenson, he wasn't even part of the group, so he's there a few times. But the inconsistency of people from day to day is very disturbing. You think you have a certain view, and you're talking the same subject with the same group day after day after day, and you're trying to make a point, but it doesn't seem that way. And Bobby Kennedy seems bouncing all over the place, and saying totally irresponsible things about it, let's over with kind of thing, and invading.
Once the president makes up his mind that he's not going to invade and he's not going to bomb, he is pretty consistent. Although he allows invasion and bombing to stay on the table, I think as a way of keeping the group, together.
Marty, sorry to interrupt you, but the things I was wondering about reading the book, and a wonderful book it is, why he doesn't just stop at some point in the deliberation and says, hey, fellas, here's what I've decided to do. Okay? Let's talk about how to implement this now. He doesn't really do that. He kind of rambles along on all this contradictory advice, most of it hawkish, but he doesn't ever say, I'm the decider, to use a recent phrase, and here's what we're going to do, guys. Get used to it. Why doesn't he do that? Well,
he actually does it through Bobby and Ted Sorensen. There were two phases of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closed phase and the open phase. The closed phase is the week from the 16th to the 22nd of October, when the United States is deciding what to do. And by day 3, Kennedy has made up his mind, we are going to blockade, we are not going to invade. And he's very clear, but he wants that group convinced. There are Republicans in that cabinet room, and there are Democrats. There are hawks and there are doves. He needs to keep everybody together. So there are two things going on during the crisis. He's dealing with Khrushchev, and he's dealing with the XCOM, with his advisors. And they're both very complicated. And they're both, things that he has to succeed at doing. Once he makes his public announcement on October 22nd, then he's dealing with Khrushchev. And so there is this great unknown out there. What is Khrushchev thinking? What is he going to do? So everybody is kind of up in the air. And again, that's what makes the read so exciting.
And once he announced the quarantine or the blockade right there, what do you think the chances are that the Soviet Union is going to abide by it?
It's going to what?
Abide by the quarantine.
Oh, abide by the blockade. Well, they have no idea. And they're very worried they're not going to abide by it. And Kennedy, again, it's very interesting how he's controlling the Navy. The Navy is very angry at the president because the president is micromanaging that. He doesn't want things to happen that he doesn't want to happen. And that's an interesting story in itself. So he lets some ships through. He stops some ships that he knows are not carrying sensitive cargo to make a point. There are 7 or 8 different things going on at the same time.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, as somebody who worked in the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs are very unimpressive. I mean, Kennedy has been in office, McNamara has been in office for 2 years, and out of the top 3 Joint Chiefs, I think 2 of them seem certifiably nuts to me, and disobedient, and in 2 years' time, don't you think you change personnel like that, or how do you explain it?
Well, I think what we have in 1962 is the holdover from World War II. These guys were, their attitude towards how to get things done was formulated during this really horrible World War for 4 years. General LeMay, who's one of those certifiable people I'm sure you're referring to.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, he's bombing,
everything.
Japan, and he thinks that's the way to get it done. So, what I would say as a general point is that war is not a good learning environment for how to deal with peace.
Okay, but during World War II, I think the generals did a pretty good job, to say the truth.
Yeah.
When you look at them, they were pretty responsible. But here, it seems like it's wacko, to tell you the truth.
That's right.
Linda, I'm not sure I could see all the questions. There's some juicy questions there from participants. Why don't you pose them to Marty?
I've got a question for you about U.S.-China relations, and what do you think the implications of the future for U.S.-China nuclear relations will be based on what you wrote in your book?
Well, the book is in effect, not only a close study of what happened in those 17 years between Hiroshima and the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it's also a study of how leaders glom on to nuclear weapons as a silver bullet to solve problems. I mean, Eisenhower does this, significantly with his massive retaliation policy, et cetera. What I am really worried about with U.S.-China relations is that the nuclear issue, which is not now the most prominent issue between the United States and China, as it was between the United States and Soviet Union, will move onto center stage. At that point, we are in a very, very dangerous situation. And I think, if I can be a little political, the Trump administration's backing away from all of these nuclear treaties is potentially a disaster and very, very dangerous.
All right, here. I have to, even though you and I differ on most everything, you're a liberal Democrat, I am a conservative, I wouldn't say Republican, former Republican, but, it is absolutely right. I have to say, in the closing minutes, your earphones are just awesome, Marty. And
I'm trying to be Walter Cronkite.
It's either Walter Cronkite or I was thinking of a DJ. Could be a new tradition with you after these 10 years spent on the book, which is. Were you happy to get it over with and stop thinking about the Cuban crisis, or do you really miss it?
Well, as you know, having written Reagan at Reykjavik, you want to finish it, and you want to see it, and on the other hand, the research was so engaging that, I missed that. So got to think of another book right away. Next question, Linda.
Well, I think we're at an end for our time right now. So I want to thank both of you for a very engaging and I think very important discussion.
Thank you.
And of course, as always, thank Alma and Joe Gildenhorn for making programs like this possible. And I'd also like to let our audience know that our next book on October 23rd is The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III by Peter Baker and Susan Glasser, which will be moderated by Andrea Mitchell. So stay tuned. We'll be sending you information about that. And thank you, everybody, for coming.
And Linda, let me say, I read that book in galleys, Susan and Peter's book, and it's wonderful. It's really wonderful. I wouldn't take sales away from Marty, but it's still
Thank you both.
Okay, thank you. Bye.